If I asked you to picture the word art, what would be the first thing that comes to your mind? Is it this? This? Maybe this? Or perhaps even this, the composition you've been listening to. Those are some great works of art, some of the most critically acclaimed of all time even. But tell me, when I asked you to picture the word art, did the first thing that come to your mind look like this? How about this? Was it this? Or maybe even to some, those seem like odd choices for what one might consider art. After all, it says right there that art is, quote, the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form such as painting or sculpture, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. See? Emphasis on primarily for their beauty or emotional power. Could one really describe their appreciation for these works as stemming from either beauty or emotional power? It seems like an obtuse way of viewing these titles. Yet, I bet if you were to ask one man what works he views as art, you might see an overlap between his answers and the media I've presented you with. Who's this man? Well, you may not know him by name, or even by photograph, but you've definitely experienced one of his works. After all, he is the creator of... No. Pump the brakes. Let's hold on for a second. I know you came to watch a video on Pokemon, but if we are going to seriously analyze these games as art, we do need to have actually talked about what is and isn't art first. Now, I'm going to start by saying a lot of things that may be considered contentious throughout this next section, so I will just preface things now by saying that if you do not agree with my views on art, that is A-okay. I don't think there's any one objective way to define art, only a series of interpretations that are shaped by a person and their worldview. Also, if you hate art and have no appreciation for it, you can skip to this point in the video to get back to the Poke talk. Okay, now that I've got that out of the way, let's talk about how I view art. Or I in air quotes, because a lot of these talking points are going to be coming from the book The Philosophy of Art, written by Kurt John Dukas? We're just going to go with Dukas. Professor at Brown University, and wow, this book is old. In spite of its age, I think it makes a lot of good points on what art is and what art can be, which is why I'm focusing the first section of this analysis to the title. That being said, let's clarify one aspect of art that might differ my view of it from others, which is that art is the process of creation and expression, not the final piece we ultimately come to view. The Mona Lisa is a work of art. It is a piece of art, if you will. It is the sum culmination of the actual artistic process itself, but it is not art in a definitional sense. I think that is a very important distinction between our perception of art and the reality of art that often gets overlooked. Now, it's not as though this interpretation is particularly hidden. Google's definition of art operates under that interpretation when it says the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination. Cambridge Dictionary has a similar definition. Merriam-Webster has it as one of its main definitions. The only site I noticed with a different interpretation was Britannica, which does view art as a finished piece first and a process of creation second. I know this seems like a pretty pedantic issue, but it is a valuable one to discuss. Why do we view art as an end product? Do you remember when I asked you to picture art? I'm sure most of you pictured works created by art, but I doubt many of you thought of something like this. This is what art truly looks like, and I think it's an aspect of the work that gets underappreciated. Every masterpiece you see had time, thought, and effort put behind it. Mona Lisa, for instance, took years to complete. Some speculate 3 years, others suggest it may have taken as long as 14. David by Michelangelo was a years-long process as well. All mediums take time to be completed. Books, movies, photography, even YouTube videos. It's all the same no matter the medium. When we only consider the end product of art, when we leave behind the work it actually takes to finish, we undervalue who art is, and as a result, we abandon its creators. I don't think it's people's fault, however. I think the disconnect between art and your average person is simply that a lot of people don't create art themselves. Many are too busy working, sleeping, spending time with family, taking on new responsibilities, etc. to have the freedom needed to work on any art of their own. Take this video, for example. I've had to delay its creation multiple times, simply because other responsibilities came up that I had to attend to. Ultimately, this video is a passion project, and when more serious events come up, it's them that has to take priority. A lot of people simply don't have the time to create, and so because of that, they don't have a sense for what the process of creation, the process of art itself, looks like. Looking at it another way, a lot of people have looked at a Renaissance-era painting before. Significantly less people have tried creating a Renaissance-era painting, or rather one that emulates the style. Because of that, it's hard to picture what art might actually look like since you have no frame of reference for the actual techniques used to render it. This is somewhat alleviated in the modern day with videos online showing how works get created, whether they be time-lapses, behind-the-scenes content, early pitches, drafts, and design documents. But that still only covers a fraction of the pieces out there in the world. The truth of the matter is, most people view work as a finished product, and as things are now, there's not a lot that can be done to change that. Unfortunate realities aside, another point on how art is viewed that I don't agree with is the idea of an objective way to view art or its works. All art is perceived under the relative values and morals of its viewer/audience. For example, if one were to critique a film, they may comment on things such as acting, pacing, themes, shot composition, music, and narrative. On a deeper level, they may heavily value the film's messaging, and depending on whether or not they agree with the messaging, will have a drastic impact on their final thoughts of the piece. Ask that same person to critique a painting, and many of their observations will be adapted and changed, however. They may choose to focus on color theory, flow, subject matter, technique, historical perspective, and detail. Topics of criticism in film and art are not mutually exclusive of one another. Both can have narratives, themes, compositions, etc. But there is still not a one-size-fits-all glove that determines what is the right way to observe the art around you, much in the same way that there's no one way to create a piece of artwork in and of itself. Even if one were to propose that each medium has its own rules and systems to follow, and that when analyzing artwork we should apply these standards and practices to each finished piece, said rules and ideas should only serve as guides for creators in helping develop their foundation of work, and should not be the end-all be-all of what artwork gets created. It's important for an illustrator to learn perspective when drawing so they can properly ground characters in the world they create, just as it is important for them to break perspective when they need to convey a feeling that rules cannot do justice to. We, the audience, view art in its works in whatever way that we will, and no one singular view on the work inherently weighs more than the others. Whose interpretation is right or wrong is relative to the values of the individual hearing or receiving the interpretation, and what will be correct and incorrect will likely change from person to person. Such is the beauty of individuality and what gives so much freedom to that which is art in and of itself. Another misconception about art I'd like to bring up is that it is a language of communication. Art does not need an audience to be art. A work does not need to be viewed by anyone, even its creator, to be considered art. Art, as we've already discussed, is the process of creation, after all, the desire to manifest one's thoughts and feelings. If a blind man were to paint a landscape that no one can see, their painting would still be a work of art. And if a deaf man were to sing a song that even they can hear, their song would still be a work like any other. It is the desire to convey, not the presence of a crowd, that determines what is and isn't art. As an example, let's look at a famous piece designed with no audience in mind so we can see what art looks like when it's a means of self-expression, not communication. Content warning. You've probably seen this painting before, since it is pretty famous. But if you haven't yet, it does depict some pretty brutal imagery that some people may find disturbing. So please skip to this point in the video if you want to avoid seeing it. Saturn Devouring His Son was a painting made by Francisco Goya in the 19th century. In it, the piece portrays Saturn, the Roman name for Kronos, leader of the Titans and father to many of the Greek gods and goddesses, in the midst of eating one of his children. Why is Kronos eating one of his children? Well, for starters, Kronos didn't eat one of his children. He ate all of them. Guess he gets a particularly killer appetite once his wife goes into labor. No, in truth, he ate each of his children because it was told to him in a prophecy that one day, one of his children would overthrow him, like he had done to his father, whose name I will choose to pronounce as Uranos, but you may choose to pronounce it however you like. If you know how Kronos overthrew his father, by the way, then let's just say I do not blame him for wanting to avoid a similar fate. Regardless, Zeus was eventually born and did indeed take over as head of the table. Saturn Devouring His Son, though, is not a piece about that moment of triumph. Francisco Goya painted this work in the privacy of his own home during a dark period in his life. Literally. The painting was one in a series later known as the Black Paintings, none of which saw public light until after his death. There's just something about this work that gives off such a sense of unease. The way Kronos dwarfs his child in scale, the pitch black surrounding them, the ghoulish expression on his face, the grip he has on his child so tight in its reach that blood is being drawn from their body onto his. It's a disturbing piece to say the least, and one of the most iconic paintings of the 19th century. Yet to me, the part about it that sticks out the most is its title. See, one thing I forgot to mention is that the painting I've shown you went untitled by Goya himself, its name instead being given after the piece had been discovered. If a work of art is defined by the artist's desire for self-expression, then perhaps we should call the piece by its proper name. I say it in jest, but this is just another way in which I feel the perception of art has caused us to undervalue its creation, and thus the actual art itself. In trying to view art via the lens of communication, and then trying to make the work more understandable to mass audiences, as opposed to seeing it for the piece that it is and the way in which it expresses itself, the true message of the work ends up being lost to time. Art is meant to be self-expression, yet we call this man Saturn and this figure his son. Was this truly Saturn devouring his son? Could it have been perhaps more broad in its messaging? Perhaps the man in the painting is meant to be a metaphor for time himself, eating away at man until there is nothing left but a fading memory of what once was. Funnily enough, Kronos is sometimes confused for Kronos, god of time. Sometimes they're even conflated to be one and the same, so perhaps the idea of someone seen as similar to Father Time eating away at his children, eating away at man, isn't far off. But let us not forget that this is still only an interpretation of the piece and should not be confused as intent by the artists themselves. Did Goya himself even have a set message he wanted to impart in its creation? It is possible for him to have created the piece out of a subconscious emotion that even he could put words to. He did leave it untitled after all. Another famous example of this kind of obfuscation of art is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which was originally titled Quasi una Fantasia, or Sonata in the Manner of a Fantasy by Beethoven himself. Over time, it became known as Moonlight Sonata after a comment made by a German critic over what the song reminded him of. Obviously, that name has stuck and is what the song is known as. But whereas Saturn devouring his son ascribes meaning where there is none provided, Moonlight Sonata overwrites meaning already provided and takes over as the main interpretation of the text. Piano Sonata 14 already had a name. Technically, it had two. Yet in spite of that, its original name is treated more as a footnote than as a legitimate way of viewing the text. And that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Even artists as prominent as Francisco Goya and Ludwig van Beethoven don't get to have their art viewed at its level, only the level provided by others. We should try to understand a work as the artist intended it, and if we are to ascribe meaning beyond that, it should only come after the work is understood as it is. Beethoven created the work he either did or didn't want to make. Audience perception does little to change that. But still, if art is the pursuit of conveyance, of self-expression, then evaluating art should be the pursuit of understanding first and the pursuit of interpretation second. The final aspect I'll be discussing about art is probably the biggest misconception art has to its name, and that is the association between art and beauty, or rather, the lack of separation between the two. In the philosophy of art, Dukas states, anyone who has ever felt the art impulse and is capable of describing accurately his then psychological state will, I think, unhesitatingly declare that his endeavor was not to create beauty, but much rather, and essentially, to give adequate embodiment in words, lines, colors, or whatnot to some particular and probably nameless feeling or emotion that possessed him. If his feeling was a pleasant feeling and the embodiment of it is adequate, the object created will indeed have beauty. On the other hand, if the feeling which possessed him was an unpleasant one, the object by constructing which he gives the feeling adequate embodiment will be ugly, but it will be a work of art nonetheless. The question in the light of which the art criticizes his own attempts at creation is not, is this beautiful? But, is this exactly what I want to do? If you've been watching for this long, then you understand that art is a means of expressing emotions, thoughts, and feelings. And while beauty can be described and intended in certain works, to say that art is intended to have beauty is missing the point of art in its entirety. This is why I have a major sticking point with the Google definition of art, as while it does focus on the idea of art as creation, its emphasis first and foremost is on the beauty of art, followed by its emotional power, which diminishes the value of art and how it can affect others on a deeper level beyond that which can be easily understood. It's not always clear what a work of art is causing you to feel. much like how the art isn't always sure of why it was created in the first place. Once the subconscious takes over, it's up to the conscious to pick up the pieces that are left behind, and thus is where the art ends and the piece begins. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, I think it's important to clear up that this analysis will be mainly of the piece of art that is Pokemon, not the art that is Pokemon itself, which I hope if you've gotten this far, you know the difference. While I will be bringing up a bit of developer insight via interviews and concept documents, Pokemon was still a game that took 6 years to develop, with a lot of that development unknown to the general public. Since a lot of my thoughts on the game will be anecdotal anyway, I want to explore the titles via what I believe the artist's intentions were, and what I take away from the games through my time playing them. With that said, thank you if you've watched this section of the video through, and for those of us who are just coming back in, roll the music! Pokemon is, by and large, the highest selling media franchise of all time. It's got toys, games, cards, socks. It's safe to say all of you at home don't need an explanation for what Pokemon is. If you didn't grow up with it, you're definitely growing up around it. What started out as a 6-year nightmare of a development cycle that nearly bankrupted its developers has transformed into one of the greatest modern dynasties of our day. That's right. The original Red and Green took so long to develop that it almost put Game Freak under the table before it even had a chance to release. But what is it about Pokemon that makes it so special? So much so that even its own creators would nearly end their own careers to try and see its inception. Let's start at games as a medium and see if we can find some answers. I feel as though games often get underappreciated as a medium for analysis. Sure, you can find channels like Super High Patch Wolf, Jacob Geller, or H Bomber Guy who take the time to dissect titles in a way that not only expresses the strengths inherent to the medium, but also shows the creator's unique voice and thus becomes a piece of work in and of itself. But, as my earlier question of what is art might have shown, when most people think of art, video games are often the last thing on people's minds. Even those that appreciate games like The Last of Us or Fallout for their artistic merit still view games as art through the lens of how close they can be compared to other mediums, like film or television. Video games can have merit in the ways they excel as pieces of literature or of narrative storytelling, don't get me wrong. But at the end of the day, they are first and foremost an interactive medium, and as such, should not be valued exclusively in how close they can get to reproducing the experience of other mediums, but rather in how it can take advantage of the unique opportunities only it can provide. Games as art shouldn't end at games as film, and games as self-expression made physical shouldn't end at surface-level observations of these descriptors. The Last of Us is art, but only in the same way that Pac-Man is art, in the same way Mario 64, Grand Theft Auto, Pong, Metroid Prime, Gran Turismo, Katamari Damacy, Street Fighter, and yes, Pokemon Red are art. See, the thing I love about video games that sets them apart from other mediums is their interactive nature. The fact that you, the audience, play an active role in how the experience plays out is crucial to the experience of playing a video game. When watching a film or a TV show, the viewer takes on a passive role. No matter the audience's desire, a story will play out in the exact same way every time, and this has given rise to a slew of incredible works that take advantage of this limitation. Additionally, even though I use that word, limitation, I do not mean it in a negative way. Much like a painter is limited by the size of his canvas, or a musician by the instruments at their disposal, art is a craft designed around constrictions. It's through these constrictions that human creativity can shine its best, and it's through the limitations that endless possibilities can be provided. Other mediums like books and comics do add a layer of interactivity via the speed in which a panel can be read, as well as the oh-so-enjoyable turning of the page that can emphasize a moment of shock, awe, wonder, horror, or so many more emotions in its viewer. But once again, the audience is participating in a linear series of events that can't actually change no matter the viewer's actions. Video games are one of the few mediums where the player has direct control over the flow of a narrative. Progression is entirely controlled by you. How does Sora defeat his enemies? Does he focus on a combination of physical attacks, magical spells, powerful summons, and a string of quick thinking and intuition? Does he just spam Disney attractions and call it a day? You get to decide that for yourself. How does Kiryu choose to explore the town of Kamurocho? Does he run straight from narrative event to narrative event? Does he stop to smell the roses, engage with the town's citizens, maybe sing at a karaoke bar or two for a momentary relief? That's entirely up to you. The flow of a game, the pacing, is nearly all at the hands of a player. Sure, some games will be more linear than others, and all games have some form of overarching narrative that is out of the player's hands. But think about it like this. If a movie can be viewed as one story that both the viewers and characters experience, then a game can be seen as two stories, one the characters experience and one the viewer plays out. It is up to the game to determine how much they want these two experiences to overlap, but overall, the willingness to hand the audience the reins in how a title is enjoyed contributes so much to games and their ability to immerse audiences. Something I like about Pokemon specifically is that the scale of overlap between their experience with the world and Red's experience with the world is majorly determined by how the player chooses to enjoy the title. A lot is known about the canon choices Red makes in the story of Pokemon. He fights the gym leaders in a certain order, he takes down Team Rocket multiple times in his adventure, becomes champion, he even has multiple canon teams depending on the title you're playing. And those teams are inspired by choices players could have made in their adventure, such as catching the sleeping Snorlax on Route 12 or picking up Eevee in Celadon City. Because of that, players can hypothetically play a version of Red's narrative that is as close to quote-unquote the canon narrative as they please. They can also choose to stray as far away from that narrative as possible. My version of Red didn't have 3 starters, he had a Bulbasaur and 5 Magikarps. His name wasn't even Red, I named him Bob. In Gym Leaders, I took on Sabrina as soon as I got the chance, and it was a piece of... So much of Red, and Pokemon Red and Tow, is customizable, and that level of player choice, in spite of how far it strays from canon, actually immerses players further into the world itself, since said world feels more like it's being affected by the player's choices and not the characters. Pokemon is still relatively linear in terms of world progression, but in providing players with so much freedom in the limitation that the games offer, in a way, it's almost like players are being provided with a canvas of their own to create from. I think that's part of the reason people really get into character customization in titles like Dark Souls, Skyrim, and The Sims, because it's one of the earliest and greatest ways that an audience is offered the chance to self-express, and thus allowing a miniature piece of work to be conceived within the creation itself. I myself play Red these days in a very non-traditional way. Whereas most people play with a full team of 6, I usually choose a team of only 3, Blastoise, Kadabra, and Raichu. The reason I do this is that I believe it creates the most consistent level progression across the region. By the time I get to the Elite 4, my team are approximately around Lorelai's in terms of level, leading to perfect and exciting encounters with the other Elite 4 members. Okay, well, as exciting as this can possibly be, at least. Another reason I chose this team is that I feel these 3 Pokemon cover all of the different type matchups I need for a playthrough. With the exception of Psychic types, which are notoriously busted in Gen 1 anyway, just about every other type has a move I can counter with. Another benefit to the reduced team size is the available party slots. Gen 1 has a lot of pretty bad HM moves that I really do not want to have to teach to my main party members, thus creating the need for an HM Broski. Due to the available party slots, I never have to worry about taking HM Broskis in and out of the PC. I can just keep them in my party for the entire playthrough, thus, I always have the necessary HMs at my disposal. I also like to catch all the legendaries, something Red does in the Origins anime, but does not do, as far as I can gather at least, in the mainline titles. Is my version of Red canon to Pokemon? No. Like, in no way whatsoever would a comparison come even close. But that's because I didn't go on Red's journey. I went on my own. And in doing so, I created a story for myself. One where I stood in Pallet Town for 30 minutes doing absolutely nothing while I wrote this section of the script. One where I fought every gym leader with a clear advantage well beyond what a trainer in the world would likely be capable of. One where I caught so little Pokemon that by the end of the game, Oak had to literally say, "Hey, come on man, try a little harder with all that." Like a Lego set that you build and then take apart, customize and have fun with. Thank you for the metaphor, naked Jacob. Pokemon is a story you create, and that's what makes it art. That's what makes it kind of beautiful. Okay, video is over. Oh, perfect. Thank you guys so much for watching. And wait, why is there so much more runtime? I said all that I needed to say. Pokemon Red is art. I even said the title of the video. What am I missing? What did I forget? Satoshi Tajiri had a fairly standard childhood. He grew up in Setagaya, Tokyo, and spent his days playing with his friends and, more importantly for this video, bug collecting. Tajiri approached bug collecting differently from the other kids, however. Whereas they would slather honey on trees and wait for the bugs to be caught up in the trap, Tajiri instead placed large rocks near the trees, grabbing the bugs that he found newly nestled in these homes. As Tajiri grew up, the forest he grew accustomed to became the products of urbanization. The trees he grew alongside were taken down, and in their place became the product of his next fascination, the arcades. Tajiri spent a lot of time in the arcades, so much so that one day he created a game guide magazine, one of the first of its kind, which he titled Game Freak. It's hard to convey through words alone how much this man loved arcade games, so instead, allow me to show you footage of Tajiri reviewing arcade titles from before his time with Pokemon. In this footage, you can see he's surrounded by what seems like, and I say this scientifically, a metric butt-ton of titles, whose boards he swaps out with a custom machine he set up, similar to how one might swap PS5 discs in their console. Because of this love, Tajiri decided one day that instead of making game guides, he would instead make games himself. This caused him to turn Game Freak from a fanzine publication to a development studio. From there, he created games like Mendel Palace, Yoshi, Mario and Wario, until one day he was discussing Dragon Quest II with Ken Sugimori, a close friend and independent artist, and was shocked to hear that a rare item he couldn't obtain in the game was one Sugimori had two of. The desire to trade items with Sugimori led his sights to the Game Boy's link cable. He thought about kids trading items with one another using the cable, and thought back to his own childhood spent bug collecting. From this, the earliest concept of Pokemon had been born. Things get a little more vague from here. Pokemon spent the next 6 years in development, Game Freak had to work on other titles to afford the project, still almost got bankrupted trying to finish it. Here's some concept documents and a clip of Junichi Masuda, composer and programmer at the time, talking about sine waves. It's funny to think about how the art of Pokemon, its actual creation, is the thing we know the least about the title, but that is oftentimes an audience's experience with a work. However, a lack of development doesn't mean we have nothing to go on. I focus so much on Tajiri and his childhood because I think that so much of your life experience affects the way you create art in a way you may never even be able to fully understand. Thus, one's childhood can clue us into so much of the intention behind a title. Look at Earthbound and its creator, Shikasato Itoi, whose childhood memory of walking into the wrong film inspired one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. This was a game made for children. With that said, if you were to ask me to guess what the emotions of Pokemon Red are, what thoughts and feelings Satoshi Tajiri, Junichi Masuda, Ken Sugimori, and the other developers were trying to capture, I would say something along the lines of curiosity, connection, and nostalgia. Curiosity in how Pokemon Red invites players to journey through its world, discover new locations, encounter mysterious Pokemon, and be given clues to character histories and lore. Connection in how the game encourages you to bond with your team, as well as with others in the real world, trading and battling each other to create new friendships and strengthen old ones. And nostalgia in how the game takes you back to a simpler time in your life, when the only thing you had to worry about were gym badges and stopping evil crime organizations. But that's just how I view the artist's connections to their work. How does Pokemon affect me as a player? How did I get into Pokemon? And what emotions does it elicit from me? Confession time. What you're hearing isn't the first version of this video. I had a completely different script equal in length to the one that you're currently hearing that ended up being scrapped because I didn't feel as though it did justice to what I wanted to say in this project. So why is it that I would take so much stock in a series that I would undo weeks worth of work to talk about it in greater detail? Perhaps some history may enlighten us. I was born only a few years after Pokemon had first hit the West, and because of that, I was surrounded by Pokemon before I could even form words. Ash and Pikachu would be blasting Team Rocket into the sky of my television. Trading cards would scatter across my desk as my friends and I would play a game of whose cards looked the coolest. Countless road trips and late nights would be spent staring into my DS screen, as I journeyed through Sinnoh in what I'm sure had no correlation to my future vision problems. As more of my brain began to develop, however, I found myself drifting apart from the series. Pokemon was for kids after all, and so my attention was drawn to the series that appealed to the older demographic. Series like Beyblade, Bakugan, Naruto, Dragon Ball, especially Yu-Gi-Oh!, and some other series I'm probably forgetting about. It wasn't until decades later, at the chiseled age of 13, that I found myself getting interested in Pokemon again. At the time, I started to see videos recommended to me from creators like Tamashi Hiroka or Jaywitz, who dedicated their channels to discussing Pokemon, or creators like The Completionist. Oh man, anyone here watch The Completionist? Well, there was him, as well as others like Some Call Me Johnny, who reviewed some of the titles on their channel. This was also when you'd see Pokemon trivia videos from people like Did You Know Gaming or Yuri of Wind get popular. You could consider this period in time a sort of Pokemon renaissance, at least in regards to YouTube content creation. And because of it, I decided to go back to the series I had abandoned for so many years. The first game I decided to pick up was Pokemon Soul Silver. It was highly regarded as one of the best titles in the series, and seeing as I didn't have a Game Boy lying around just yet, I decided to pick up a copy from GameStop. This was back in the day where your average 13-year-old could actually afford to buy one of these games. Oh my god! When I got home and booted it up, words couldn't do justice to the magic that unfolded. Those first few hours exploring Johto, meeting the rival, taking on the gym leaders, Team Rocket, experiencing all of the things that I loved about the series again for the first time was an experience I could never forget. It wasn't just that the game was great. The time I spent apart from Pokemon was equally as important to my enjoyment of it. It was allowing myself to step away from a series I loved so that I could grow and experience new things, whether that be in the form of books, TV shows, games, and so much more. All of those new experiences allowed for me to enter the title with a reinvigorated perspective on media as a whole. It wouldn't be hyperbole to say that Pokemon Soul Silver changed my life. After completing Soul Silver, I had to keep playing more Pokemon. I figured since I had played through one of the more modern titles, that I would go back to the game that started it all. I bought a red Game Boy from GameStop and a Pokemon Red cartridge from Amazon. And to be honest, I don't remember that much of my first playthrough of Red. I know I enjoyed it by the fact that I'm still playing it, but if it even left a strong impression on me initially is completely up in the air. This may cause some viewers to ask the question, PKG, if Pokemon Soul Silver is the game that changed your life, and Pokemon Red is just a game that you can barely remember the initial experience of, why is this even a Red retrospective in the first place, and not a video about Soul Silver? That is a very valid question, and one that I've had to ask myself multiple times while working on this video. I think the difference is this. I don't play Soul Silver that often anymore. My last playthrough of the game was when I was still in college, at least 3 years ago. In fact, I would stagger to guess that I've played the game fully maybe 3 to 4 times period. That sounds like a lot, but keep in mind that I've played Persona 4 an equal amount of times, and that game is, oh no, in terms of length. I love Soul Silver, and it will always have a special place in my heart. But there's a reason I can remember Soul Silver's first playthrough and not Red's. And it's not because Soul Silver is so much better as a game. The reason is that I've just played Red that much more than any other Pokemon title. If Soul Silver was completed 3 to 4 times, I'd guess Red has been completed fully at minimum twice as many times as that. I've gone through the game so many times that the initial experience of it has been completely overwritten by all the other playthroughs I've done of it. It would be no exaggeration to say that Pokemon Red is one of my most played through games of all time, right next to the likes of Kingdom Hearts 2, Personas 4 and 5, and Splatoon on the Wii U. Yeah, I was one of those kids. So what about Red keeps me coming back? Why do I choose it over objectively better titles in the series? What is it about Red that resonates with me so much? I've already discussed what I believe Pokemon to mean to its creators, feelings of curiosity, connection, and nostalgia. But it's time now to discuss the emotions I feel from my time with the title. To put it plainly, Pokemon Red is 2 things to me: comfort and intricacy. At its most stripped down, those are the core aspects of the title that most appeal to me. Before we can get into Pokemon as a means of comfort though, let's first discuss the idea of Pokemon being intricate. To your average onlooker of today, Pokemon is a baby game for baby people. To say it's simple is stating the obvious, but to describe it as intricate might raise some eyebrows. To understand what I mean, let's look at one of the most crucial aspects of any playthrough, the thing men will fight to the death for, and in which love and admiration can be gained and lost. That's right, I'm talking about starter Pokemon are the core foundation to any player's journey. They're the first Pokemon on a player's team and thus they are the sun for which your other Pokemon revolve around. But how can something as easy for most as "I like the green one" be considered a complex decision for players to make? Let's run through an example for you to see. Let's say you choose to go with Bulbasaur as your starter. After all, the English manual does recommend picking him if you're a first-time player. In choosing the grass starter, first-time players have a type advantage against Brock, Misty, and resist Lieutenant Surge's Pokemon, meaning that up till the 3rd badge, players could go through the early section of the game just using their starter. Once you get to the 4th gym, however, is where things start to change. See, Erica is a grass-type gym leader, meaning her Pokemon hard counter yours for neutral damage. It's at this point in the playthrough where you'll have to expand your team if you want to continue the run. Luckily, you just so happen to find a Growlithe on a nearby route. Growlithe isn't the world's strongest Pokemon, but his Fire-type moves should help you eke out the victory against Erica. Next up is Koga, however, whose bulky, Poison-type Pokemon wipe out your Growlithe and Bulbasaur with ease. Now, there's a couple of ways you can go about dealing with this. See, nearby is the Safari Zone, an area full of Pokemon to catch, including ones that have a type advantage against Koga, such as Rhyhorn, Kangaskhan, or Marowak. Additionally, you can go back to Vermilion City where Lieutenant Surge is to catch either a Diglett or Drowsy, both of which also cover type weaknesses. You could even go back to Cerulean to train up an Abra, whose high special stats will make future encounters with basically any other Pokemon, except for Psychic types, a complete breeze. You have a lot of choices in how you want to build teams and take on gym leaders as a result. And it's decisions like these that add a lot of intricacy to the team building of Gen 1. See how this one simple choice of your starter has led to a domino chain of greater decisions and options for the player to make? "I like the green one" has transformed from an arbitrary choice at the start of the game to a series of meaningful choices as the game progresses. This even gets more interesting when choosing the other 2 starters, as their type matchups against Brock and Misty force players to make decisive decisions about their team composition earlier on in the playthrough. Starter Pokemon were designed to ease players into the world's games and systems. They teach players about the value of type coverage and even serve as a pseudo-difficulty selection, with Bulbasaur being considered the easy mode and Charmander being considered the game's hard mode. They are one of the ways in which the game melds complex systems with simple execution, but they are just the first we're going to be talking about today. I know what you may be thinking. This guy is not about to justify only having 4 moves on a Pokemon. That's one of the universally agreed on biggest issues with the series. Surely, only an idiot would actually try to defend the stance on the internet, which to that I say, it is true that only being allowed to have 4 moves on one Pokemon seems like an arbitrary decision made to pacify the title, removing complexity to dumb things down for a wider audience. But there's a lot more to that decision than what you may think, and it serves to make the game more engaging by creating expression via restriction. Oh hey, expression via restriction. Where have I heard that before? If you look at games like Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, or even Mothers 1 and 2, when a character learns a new move, that move is added to their move list. It is now a permanent feature of that character's toolset, and what begins as a game of 1 or 2 options in combat can expand to an innumerable number of choices that the player has at their disposal. Pokemon starts out the same, 1 or 2 moves that can expand to cover an innumerable amount of options. The difference, however, is once a Pokemon learns their 5th move, they must either decide between getting rid of one of their currently learned moves or foregoing learning the new move permanently. And in Gen 1, I do mean permanently. Unlike in later generations, there isn't a move tutor to help you learn moves your Pokemon has forgotten. Once that move is gone, it's gone for good. Sometimes, the decision is really easy, like forgetting Bubble to learn its stronger counterpart, Bubble Beam. Other times, the decision can be difficult, like choosing between a move like Recover, which heals your Pokemon, or a Light Barrier, a move that strengthens your Pokemon's special defense. Pokemon serve less as Swiss Army knives, and more as just knives. Built for one function, serve to precise execution. That's not to say there's no player expression, quite the opposite. Much like how a photographer confines his subject matter to his camera lens and thus gives weight to what they choose to capture, the choice of which Pokemon moves to keep and which moves to forget offers a lens that one can use to view the player. Add on to the fact that TMs, which provide players with further customization amongst party members, and the restriction of TMs, that they can only teach a move once, and we see how these systems lead to a myriad of unique choices made by the player of each title. Let's take a Pokemon like Blastoise for example. Blastoise is my favorite Pokemon in the series. I've been using him on my red team since my very first playthrough, and I have a very large soft spot for the guy. When I play through red, I want my Blastoise to absolutely slaughter anything that comes across its path. Not only is Blastoise blessed with all-around good bulk, both offensively and defensively, but its wide list of learnable moves means you'll have access to a lot of different options for him in combat. One of the things I love most when playing a Pokemon game is beating an opponent whose Pokemon counter my own. What's that? Dig has the same base power as Earthquake in Gen 1? It sure would be unfortunate if Wartortle could learn it right before my fight with Lieutenant Surge and Erica. This is what my final moveset on Blastoise usually looks like. Surf, for obvious reasons, Blizzard to take out Grass and Dragon types, Strength because it's hilarious to imagine Blastoise chucking an Alakazam across the room, and Earthquake to cover the electric type weakness. But that's just my Blastoise. Your Blastoise might focus more on raw destruction through moves like Hydro Pump and Hyper Beam, or have it stall while you heal the rest of your party via its bulky defenses. Point is, there are a lot of Blastoises that players can create, because the systems are in place to allow customization on that level. And because Pokemon can only learn 4 moves, players have to be willing to either commit to their setups, or go through the process of respeccing their Mon in order to create a well-rounded team. It's a surprisingly deep decision to ask of the player, and I think it adds a lot of cool decisions that often get overlooked by general audiences when broadly speaking on the titles. Does that mean I still think Pokemon should have the 4-move system in place? It certainly wouldn't hurt to try something new. I myself personally like the idea of Pokemon retaining all learned moves and choosing 4 to bring into battle. But as for the original titles, Red and Blue, I think this system is just about as good as it gets. One of the coolest aspects of Gen 1 is its map design, and its emphasis on player choice. At first the map starts out basic. You go from Pallet Town to Viridian City, then immediately are given the choice between going straight into Viridian Forest or taking a detour to what you'll soon learn is the Pokemon League. Obviously, you don't have the gym badges to enter the Pokemon League yet, but the fact that it's presented to you right from the start keeps players engaged with the gym challenge. Every badge earned is a reminder that you're one step closer to making it back to the Champions Path. From there, you go through Pewter City, Celadon City, and Vermilion City, but as soon as you try to enter Saffron, you're stopped by a guard and told the road's closed. You're gonna have to find a way around. The game doesn't hold your hand with the solution either. No character comes around to guide you on what to do next. It's up to the player to go through Diglett's Cave, talk to Professor Oak's aide, and get the HM for Flash. The player then has to remember that they were blocked off from a path earlier on in Cerulean City, and that the cut HM they were given by the captain of the SSN can cut down the tree blocking them from further progression. The level of faith that the game has in the player to figure these things out is actually pretty commendable, and the way the game is taking you up and down and all around the map is pretty great as well. Notice how it isn't a linear point A to B. It starts straightforward, but new paths open and close depending on when the player is in the title. I haven't even gotten to the best example of this though, which is when the player gets to Celadon City. See, at Celadon City, the player can buy a bottle of water from the vending machine. This might seem like just a cool piece of world building, but in actuality, it is one of the most important items in the game. See, that guard blocking off Saffron City mentioned he was feeling pretty thirsty. I wonder if... And there you have it, folks. You've just gained access to 2 new cities, Fuchsia and Saffron. What's great about this isn't just that you can now explore these towns. You can even fight their gym leaders in any order that you want. That's right, gym leaders 4, 5, and 6 can be taken on in any order. Now, obviously, their levels don't change to match your teams, so Sabrina will likely wipe out your party if you take her on too early. But this level of player freedom really enhances the feeling of it being your adventure. It's just another way the gameplay gets interesting player choices in seemingly simple game design. Pokemon games are known for their basic storytelling. Get all 8 badges, catch some Pokemon, maybe stop a terrorist organization or 2 before dinner, become the champion. In fact, I wasn't even describing Pokemon Red just there. I was describing the plot of Ruby and Sapphire. These stories are bare bones, and frankly, that's a-okay with me. Pokemon games have never been known for having deep, compelling narratives. When I'm playing Pokemon, I'm here for the gameplay And I think that's where the titles are at their best anyway. That being said, I think a lot of people assume that Pokemon games have no layers to their storytelling because of the simplicity, and that is something I wholeheartedly disagree with. Take a character like Professor Oak, for example. When we first meet him, he's a pretty unassuming guy. He studies Pokemon, wants you to do some research for him, go play the game now. But there's a hint to his past in his first bit of dialogue. He mentions that he was a serious trainer when he was young, but now only has 3 Pokemon left. This one line alone raises so many questions in the viewer. How serious of a trainer was Oak? How far did he get in his Pokemon journey? Why does he only have 3 Pokemon left? Did he release the others in the wild? Did they die? And why are the 3 Pokemon he has left ones that can't be found in any wild grass in the region? There's so much you can interpret from this one-liner text, and this kind of vague mystery meant to spark the player's interest isn't just me reading too deep into things. It's a philosophy that the game's creators had when designing the games. Ken Sugimori, in an interview with Tetsuya Endo, the creator of Xevious, alongside Satoshi Tajiri, was quoted with the following: "I think it was important that Endo-san left the mystery, in Xevious, vague. That's why, even when people ask me various questions about Pokemon, I try not to answer too clearly. For example, I'm often asked, how many Pokemon are there? But would it really be more interesting if you knew how many there were? I think it's different. The fact that you can enjoy it more deeply by leaving it vague is something that I learned from my experience with Xevious and hold dear." Keep in mind that Satoshi Tajiri was obsessed with arcades back in the day, and thus would have the same level of love for Xevious that Ken Sugimori has. In fact, one of Game Freak's most pivotal issues was its guide on Xevious, which was the first big success story for the company. Xevious holds a place near and dear to these designers' hearts, and it's easy to see how the mysteries of Xevious led to the developers choosing to make a story that said just enough to raise questions, but not enough to prevent imagination from taking things from there. Another aspect of the narrative that is universally enjoyed is the relationship between the player character and their rival. Blue, spelled like this in my playthrough, can be described through many Wiener-esque tendencies. He's petty, impatient, cocky, hot-headed, and textbook annoying. He isn't always humanly imaginable, perfect to be your rival. And so because of that, he is the perfect character for you to butt heads with throughout the journey. You fight Blue a lot in Pokemon Red, at least 8 times if I recall, and each time you fight him during the early sections of the game, he has a slightly different team. Like a new player, Blue is doing a lot of experimenting with his team, figuring out what works and what doesn't, and it really helps enhance the feeling that he has a real thinking process, and is consciously making adjustments to his team to see what works and what doesn't. You, not Red, you develop a real bond with the kid. Sure, it's one of hatred and a desire to one-up him, but that shows that the game is doing its job of getting the players emotionally invested in its characters. There is something so cathartic about beating him, even after all these years of playing the title. His character arc is also satisfying to see as well, seeing him develop from a cocky novice to a serious trainer, before ending his journey as a failed champion forced to reckon with the mistakes he made along the way. It's all pretty interesting stuff, and seeing his sprite change to reflect these changes is good art design as well. You really get the feeling this kid went on an adventure of his own, and even though it didn't turn out how he intended it to, there's still a feeling that if he sticks to the path presented to him by his rival, there might be a time where he could be number 1 once again. When I show you this screen, what am I showing you exactly? Well, to many, it's obvious. I'm showing you a Pokemon battle, right? That is what we're seeing. You tell the Pokemon to fight, and it does so. But what are you actually looking at? It's not as though what we're witnessing is an accurate portrayal of how fights really play out. A closer depiction of that can be found in other Pokemon media, such as the anime or manga. No, what we're seeing here is an abstract work of art, far more similar to this than to this. Take a painting like Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh, for example. And yes, I am going to talk about art again, you cannot stop me. Starry Night is not attempting to be a realistic depiction of its subject matter. Rather, it's choosing to abstract the world its creator sees to highlight and exaggerate the parts of it that Van Gogh wants the viewers to focus on. The serene breeze that passes through, the warm glow emitted by the moon and the stars, the gentle slopes of the hillside, and the calm town enveloped by all the wonders above it. This feeling and the words that emerge from it come from when an artist is able to successfully bring you into their reality. And with Pokemon, it's the same experience. We almost take it for granted that what we are watching is a fight happening. Pokemon is so good at abstracting reality that you forget at times that what you are watching is two JPEGs mean mug each other. This doesn't end at the fights, however. Have you ever noticed how Pokemon towns don't really make sense as actual towns people would inhabit? There aren't any restaurants, grocery stores, gas stations, bathrooms. There's like one area intended for recreational activity in each town. Most locations comprise of a few houses, a Pokemon Center, a Pokemon Mart, that town's one unique activity, and then the gym. That's because making the town realistic wouldn't make the town more engaging. Sure, if you asked a certain YouTuber, they would say it improves the experience, and certainly as technology progresses and the games develop from 2D to 3D, these things become more necessary to add. But these games were made on outdated hardware, even at the time. So with an already abstract aesthetic in the pixel art, designing a world that highlights the key areas of interest not only keeps players focused on the goal of completing the Pokemon challenge, but it adds just enough flavor to each city to make them feel unique from one another. It's things like this, little concessions the developers make due to hardware limitations, and the ways these limitations are overcome, that lend so much to the titles. That being said, I've been talking a lot about the positives of Pokemon Red, and the way in which they are a piece of art I enjoy. So I think it's only fair that I take a moment to talk about the things that hold the game back for me. For as much as I love Pokemon Red, it does have some pretty major flaws. For example, why do I have to talk to the Rocket Grunt after I already beat him to get him to drop the lift key? Whose idea was this? Other such flaws are the following. Trainer teams in Pokemon Red have an incredibly low selection of Pokemon to them. A lot of teams consist of the same low-level fluff, such as Rattata, Pidgey, and Coughing, throughout most of the title. It's clear they're meant to serve as grind spots for any new members added to your party, but a high variety in team designations would go a long way in keeping these grind sessions more engaging. This gets even worse when you fight the main villain team of the title, Team Rocket, whose pool of 4 to 5 unique Pokemon collectively exasperates this issue to a grueling extent. Team Rocket are known for stealing other people's Pokemon, and I think giving them Pokemon from specific archetypes to reflect who they're stealing from not only enhances the narrative, but it ties that narrative to the gameplay in a satisfying way. As it is, a lot of battles in the title are a slog, which isn't exactly what you want in a game about fighting. Continuing on from this, gym leader battles are, well... Hey Erica, how's it? While I obviously have a lot of experience with the titles, and thus my time with the gym leaders isn't reflective of other people's playthroughs, it doesn't change the fact that I'm usually on autopilot throughout most of these fights. I happen to be wrapping up a Pokemon Emerald playthrough while playing this game, and the difference in strategy and mental thought going into each fight was night and day. While the breezy nature of the games is a large part of its appeal for me, I wouldn't have minded boss fights that required more attention from me as a player. The biggest issue with Kanto for me, and the biggest issue stemming from the world progression, is the level curve. Because so much of the mid-game can be taken on in any order you want, it means all the Pokemon in these areas have to be relatively low-leveled, to account for the players going in with relatively weak teams. Even when you unlock access to later areas like the water routes, it still feels like the game is holding back on making trainer Pokemon scale to your level. It can be considered surprisingly immersive world building, in that it allows for you to interpret that most people are casual trainers who don't have very strong teams because training up their Drowsies and Zubats just isn't that big of a priority for them. But given the other ways in which the game abstracts things for player enjoyment, this seems like a design choice that heavily works against the title. You may be wondering why I didn't bring up the other complaints people have with the titles, such as the terrible level-up movesets every Pokemon has, the bad sprites, or the broken psychic type. And in all honesty, these things just don't affect my experience with the titles that much. I love the bad sprites. I think they're great. Kadabra's a day one homie, so he can be as broken as he wants to be. And the terrible movesets largely don't affect the team that I use in each playthrough. This section is about my personal issues with the title, so that's why I'm choosing to focus on the parts that affect my experience the most. With that said, I've spent enough time talking about why Pokemon evokes feelings of intricacy from me. Let's move on to why Pokemon Red is comfort. Talking about why something is comforting to you is a little hard to put into words. Pokemon Red is a game I grew up with after all. It's crazy to think about it, but 11 years have passed since I first started playing it. So much has changed in that time span. I grew taller, I started high school, graduated high school, I started and finished college, I moved out to the West Coast to work at 343 Industries for a time. I've traveled to places like Jamaica, Spain, Denmark, France. Most of the best food I've ever had has come from this time period, as well as some of the worst pieces of food I wouldn't even wish upon my worst enemy. I have changed and grown so much in all those years, and my taste in media has refined as a result. But no matter how much of me shifts, I know I always find myself wanting to return to Pokemon Red and experiencing the journey of taking on Kanto all over again. There's just something to picking up a game you know you'll love, being able to relive all the moments you hold near and dear. That kind of comfort is one that grows stronger with time. No matter where I am, no matter what's happening around me, Pokemon Red will always be there to keep me grounded, something only few other pieces of media can achieve. Will I still be playing Red 20 years from now? 40 years from now? I don't know, but I still enjoy playing it today, and there's something about that I think is kind of nice. In fact, I'd say it's kind of beautiful. Wow, whew. This video took way longer than I expected. I wasn't kidding when I said I scrapped the first script I wrote for this video. I really did start the entire video over from scratch, and doing all the research plus rewriting took quite a bit of time. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to, I guess, like, subscribe, and comment? I'm not usually a fan of recommending doing all those things, or when other YouTubers do all those things, but seeing as this is literally my first video, and I definitely do want it to be seen by an amount of people, please, if you enjoyed it, it would really help out and I would really appreciate it. Let's see. What else did I write? I have no idea. True, I don't have any idea if this video is going to perform well, but I would love to continue making more of these, so spread the word once again, and that might expedite when more content comes out. Regardless of whether it gets 1 view or 100 views though, or a million billion, I hope it gets 1 billion views, we'll have to see. Regardless, I'm going to keep making content anyway. I at least have, I'm not going to say how many other video ideas, but I have, let's just say, a few other ideas. They have there's nothing on them yet. There's no progress on them yet, but I'm probably going to at least make those videos, and then we'll kind of see from there where things go. That being said, take care, everybody, and I hope y'all have a nice day. See ya.